The sound hit me like a gunshot. My front door shook in its hinges, vibrating all the way through the hallway before settling into a suffocating silence. For a moment, I didn't move. I just stood there with the dish towel still in my hand, the smell of boiled rice lingering in the air, and my heart suddenly beating a strange, uneasy rhythm. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, casual, carefree, crunching across the gravel driveway. I walked toward the open door, and that's when I saw him. My son. My only child. The same boy whose father taught him how to check oil levels in the driveway every Saturday morning. And there he was, tossing a set of car keys in the air, catching them with the smug ease of a man who'd just done something clever, not catastrophic. He didn't even look up when he spoke. Just flicked the keys again, letting them glint in the afternoon sunlight. Mom, stop overreacting. The car is gone. I sold it. The keys slapped into his palm one last time before he shoved them into his pocket, keys that no longer belonged to a car that no longer belonged to us. For a second, I didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't understand. What did you just say? I whispered, stepping out onto the porch, my hand gripping the railings so hard my fingers cramped.
He finally looked at me then.
And God, the indifference in his eyes almost knocked me off my feet. I said I sold it, he repeated in that tone. That infuriating tone he used whenever he believed he was the only reasonable person in the room. You never used it anyway. My mouth went dry. That car wasn't just a vehicle. It wasn't even just a keepsake. It was my husband, the last thing of his that still smelled faintly like him. The car he polished every single Saturday, even when arthritis stiffened his fingers. The car he promised to teach our granddaughter to drive someday. And now it was gone. You sold. The word crumbled in my throat. Your father's car? He sighed, like I was the problem here. Mom, please, he scoffed. Don't make this a big thing. I needed the money more than you needed some old metal collecting dust. A cold wave rolled over me, crawling up my spine until it sat like ice behind my eyes. Old metal. Old metal. That old metal was the last piece of my husband I still had in this world. The last thing I hadn't let anyone touch. 8 months since my husband died. 8 months of sleeping alone, eating alone, and sitting inside that car whenever the grief got too heavy. That car kept me from drowning. And my son had ripped it away like it was garbage. You're crying? He asked, incredulous, actually laughing. Mom, come on. It's not that serious. You should be grateful it didn't go to waste. I felt the earth tilt under me. Grateful? I repeated. My voice didn't even sound like mine. You want me to be grateful that you sold your father's car without even telling me? He shrugged. Look, things have been tight. I figured you wouldn't mind. And before you start, yes, everything is finalized. Papers signed. Money gone. Deal done. I staggered backward into the doorway, gripping the frame to steady myself. My hands were trembling so hard the dish towel slipped right out of my fingers. When did you sell it? I managed to ask. Yesterday morning, he replied casually. The buyer came early. I handled everything. You didn't need to be involved. Didn't need to be involved. My vision blurred. I'm your mother, I whispered. That was your father's car. He rolled his eyes. Oh my God, Mom. You're being dramatic again. It's a car. A thing. You always get so emotional about stuff that doesn't matter. Didn't matter. To him, maybe. But to me, it was everything. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady the shards of my heart. He was standing there like he'd just taken out the trash, not like he'd committed the one betrayal I never imagined he was capable of. He started walking back toward his truck, whistling, as if he hadn't just ripped open a wound so deep I could barely breathe. He looked over his shoulder one last time. You'll thank me eventually, he said. Really, this was for the best. And then he drove off, gravel spitting under his tires, leaving me frozen in the doorway of the house my husband and I built with our bare hands. My tears finally fell, but they weren't just grief. They were something darker, because if he thought this was over, If he thought I would just accept this. He didn't know his own mother at all. He sold my husband's car. But what the buyer showed me later made my blood run cold. They tell you grief changes how you taste the world. I never understood until that first morning after he died, when toast tasted like ash and silence sounded like thunder. 8 months later, grief had settled into the corners of my house like dust, quiet, patient, and impossible to sweep away. My name is Dorothy. I was married to Frank for 42 years. We built our life on small rituals. Sunday coffee at 7, the way he hummed when he fixed the radio, his slow, careful polishing of the car every Saturday morning until the leather shone and the chrome caught the sunlight like a promise. People thought of it as his pride. I thought of it as his presence. That car was more than metal and upholstery. When I opened its door, I could still feel his elbow against mine on long drives. I could still smell the faint ghost of his cologne in the air vents. Nothing strong, just a little tether that made a house into a home. On nights when the grief was heavy, I would drive for 20 minutes with no destination, just to hear the engine talk back to me and remember his laugh. It sounds silly to some people, but that's how love sows itself into ordinary things. He had given me the car keys the day before he went into the hospital, like he wanted to make sure I knew how to keep going without him. "Take it when the weather's nice," he said, patting the dashboard. "Drive to the lake. Don't let it sit." I promised him I would. I promised a lot of little things in those final frantic weeks, but I kept that one. I drove the car less often than I should, maybe, because every time I slid into that driver's seat, I felt like I was sitting on a memory, but I never thought I'd have to watch someone else drive it away. The truth is, the car was my sanity. When everyone else moved around my sorrow like it was something contagious, the car was steady and honest. It never asked why I cried or why I slept poorly. It just waited, patient and familiar. The world outside changed. Friends drifted, conversations shortened, but the leather and the radio and the way the steering wheel fit my hands stayed the same. So when my son told me he'd sold it, it wasn't just a transaction. It felt like a theft of time and tenderness. I felt something inside me fracture. Unequal parts grief, anger, and bewilderment. He didn't see the car as a shrine. To him, it was a depreciating asset, an old thing that cost him nothing to part with. I kept thinking about the mornings when Frank would smile and rub the hood like you would a sleeping animal. I kept thinking about the small paper napkin where he once scribbled our granddaughter's first driving lesson notes. Those little scraps of life had been tucked behind the glove compartment for safekeeping. Had they been tossed aside with the floor mats? Who had rifled through our memories and decided they weren't worth saving? There's a physical reaction to betrayal that hits harder than sadness. It's cold and electric, like someone has emptied your stomach and filled it with stones. My hands started to shake. The coffee I just poured went cold on the counter because I couldn't lift the cup. I had to steady myself against the sink, pressing my palms into the porcelain until the tremor slowed. My heart pounded as if it were trying to climb out of my chest and run after him. Beyond the anger was a quieter, deeper hurt, the small, cruel realization that I had been invisible in my own family. The last 8 months had been a string of little erasures. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls shortened. My son and his wife began to speak in a tone that implied I was a problem to be managed. They had been patient enough to let me grieve, up to a point. Once that point passed, I was expected to be small, grateful, and compliant.
That was not me.
I wasn't the woman who would tuck away sorrow and let the people I loved strip away her anchors. The car had been his promise to me, a word kept through decades. His footprints were still in the trunk if you listened close enough. Receipts, old maintenance tags, the crumpled tissue he used when he laughed. I could feel every one of those tiny things like fingernail scratches across the surface of my heart. So when he said the sale had been final and yesterday, the words landed like a verdict. Papers signed. Money gone. No consultation. No warning. No asking. It wasn't just the loss of a thing. It was the obliteration of the last ordinary way I could touch my husband. I pressed a hand to the place behind my ribs where the hurt sat. I wiped my face with the back of my wrist and tried to steady the tremor in my voice. If grief had taught me anything, it taught me to keep my feet. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the moment I realized I would have to fight for whatever bits of him still remained, even if it meant standing up to my own son. And I would. There are certain tones that slice straight through your chest. Not because of what is said, but because of the quiet, condescending way it's delivered. The tone that tells you, without needing the dictionary definition, that you're being dismissed, reduced, shrunk into something small and inconvenient. That's the tone my daughter-in-law, Lacey, used when she finally stepped into the doorway, arms crossed, hip tilted like she was posing for an argument she'd already won. She appeared behind my son, as if she had been waiting for her cue. "Dorothy, seriously? You're crying over a car? Not, are you okay?" Not, what happened. Just that tight little half-laugh, the kind people use when they want to make your pain sound ridiculous. I turned toward her slowly, still gripping the kitchen counter with one hand because my legs hadn't quite decided if they trusted the floor. Her eyes flicked over me the way someone glances at a stain they don't have time to clean. Annoyed. Impatient. That car, I managed, belonged to your father-in-law. It meant something. She tilted her head, smiling the way a kindergarten teacher smiles at a child who hasn't caught up with the lesson. "Dorothy, darling," she said, dragging out the word like honey she hoped would hide the sting. "Clinging to old things isn't healthy. You really should learn to let go." Let go. If she only knew how tightly I'd been clinging to reality these past 8 months. How every object, every photo, every corner of this house had its own gravitational pull tying me back to the man I loved. The thought of letting go felt like standing on a cliff with no guardrail. My son didn't step in. Didn't defend me. He just stood beside her, arms folded like he was echoing her posture. Like they'd rehearsed this. Like he needed her backbone to keep himself upright. "She's right, Mom," he added. "If Dad were still here, he'd tell you to move on." My breath caught. "No," I said instantly. No, he wouldn't. But they exchanged a look. That look. The one that said they'd made up their minds long before they walked into this kitchen. The same look they'd been giving each other for months, whenever I said something they didn't like. A quick glance, a tiny eye roll, a silent agreement that I was the irrational one. The problem. The burden. The outdated piece of furniture they weren't sure how to throw away politely. Lacey took a step closer, lowering her voice as if she were trying to soothe me, though her eyes were all sharp edges. "You don't even drive anymore," she said. "You barely leave the house. What did you need the car for, really? It was just wasting space." I swallowed hard, anger rising like bile. "It was mine," I whispered. "It was his." She shrugged. "Well, not anymore." And honestly, she waved her manicured hand. The buyer was happy. Said it was exactly what he was looking for. It's nice when things find their purpose, don't you think? There was something in her tone, something too rehearsed, too deliberate, that made my stomach twist. I didn't know what it meant yet, but the way she said the buyer felt off, like she knew more than she was saying. And my son heard it too. He shot her a quick sideways glare before plastering that fake calm expression back on his face. "That's enough," he said sharply. "Mom needs time." Time? Time wouldn't bring the car back. Time wouldn't undo the sale. Time wouldn't fix the casual cruelty in their eyes. It was then I noticed the keys on his keychain. The ring still had my husband's initials etched into the leather, a gift from our 25th anniversary. My son had used it to close the deal. His hands, the same hands Frank once guided while teaching him to shift gears, had signed away the one thing I wasn't ready to lose. And they thought I was being dramatic. Lacey shifted her weight again and sighed loudly. The universal sign for "I'm bored with your feelings now." "Anyway," she said, "we've got dinner reservations. We just wanted to stop by and make sure you weren't, spiraling." Spiraling? I repeated, the word burning a hole in my chest. "Yes," she said. "Mike worries about you. Sometimes people your age struggle with emotional regulation when they're grieving." There it was. The venom, wrapped in satin. A subtle suggestion that my grief was no longer appropriate, that my mind was slipping, that I couldn't be trusted with my own memories. The first brick in a wall they were quietly building between me and my own autonomy. My son nodded, as if this explanation, this insult, made perfect sense to him. "We'll talk later, Mom. Just don't get worked up." And with that, they walked out, smug, united, certain of their righteousness, leaving me alone in a house that suddenly felt smaller than ever. The villains of this story weren't strangers. They were standing in my kitchen, wearing familiar faces, and speaking in the voices I used to love. The moment they walked out, the door didn't just close, it thundered. The echo traveled through the house, bouncing across the framed photos on the walls, vibrating through the floorboards, and settling like a bruise right beneath my ribs. They didn't even look back. Not once. Not even to ask if I was okay. As their car engine roared to life in the driveway, I stayed frozen, one hand still gripping the counter the way a drowning person grabs the edge of a boat. Their voices were muffled through the window, laughter, light and careless. Lacey said something I couldn't make out, and Mike barked a laugh, so sharp it cut straight through the glass. They weren't just leaving. They were celebrating. The realization landed in my chest like a brick. They didn't feel guilty. They didn't feel conflicted. They felt justified. Somehow, in this twisted little story they'd written in their heads, I was the dramatic obstacle, and they were the practical heroes. When their tires screeched off down the street, silence filled the house again, but it wasn't the soft silence of mornings with Frank or evenings reading on the porch.
No.
This silence was sharp, violent. It pressed against my skin, insisting on one truth I could no longer ignore. I was completely alone, except for the truth they didn't know I had. My breath shook as I turned back toward the living room. The space felt unfamiliar, as though their footsteps had rearranged the air itself. I took 2 steps and stopped. My reflection stared back at me from the hallway mirror, eyes red, cheeks streaked with tears, shoulders slumped forward like the weight of the last 8 months had finally won. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. Something I hadn't felt in months. Something I didn't think I'd ever feel again. Resolve. My husband used to say grief was like fog. It hangs heavy until a moment of clarity cuts through and shows you the road. And standing there in that hallway, staring at a version of myself I barely recognized, clarity finally broke through. Because yes, I had lost him. Yes, I had lost the softness we built together. But I had not lost my mind. I had not lost my memory. And I had not lost my right to the one thing they had no business touching. The car wasn't theirs to sell. I walked back to the kitchen table and sat down slowly, hands pressing flat against the surface to steady myself. My mind replayed the moment Frank had insisted on adding my name to the car's title. I remembered laughing at him, telling him it wasn't necessary, that we shared everything anyway. But he insisted. He always insisted on the things that mattered. Just in case, he'd said, giving me that crooked smile that made the corners of his eyes wrinkle. You never know what life will throw at us. Just in case. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Because now, today, those 3 simple words were the only lifeline left between me and the thing they had stolen. My fingers trembled as I pulled open the drawer where I kept important documents. Receipts, insurance papers, outdated warranties. Everything was still there, loosely organized, the way Frank had left it. But the envelope labeled CAR title was missing.
Gone.
I froze. My heart began pounding again, but this time it wasn't just from grief. It was from certainty. Someone had been through my husband's documents before today.
Someone had looked for something.
Someone had prepared for this. That someone was my son. My stomach twisted as the truth settled into place. They didn't sell the car impulsively. They sold it intentionally.
Strategically.
And the missing envelope meant they dug through things they had no right to touch. I pushed back from the table and stood. My knees were weak, but my purpose wasn't. If the envelope was gone, then the DMV would have the transfer records. The buyer's name.
The date.
The sale amount, all of it. And I needed that information more than I needed air. I grabbed my purse, slipped my shoes on, and reached for my keys. But before walking out, I took one last look at the empty driveway, at the patch of sunlit gravel where my husband's car used to sit, gleaming like a promise he kept even after his death. And something inside me hardened. They thought I would break. They thought grief made me fragile. They thought I was too old, too soft, too small to do anything but sit and mourn. But they forgot something. They forgot who I was before I was a widow. They forgot the strength life had carved into me long before they were born. They forgot that Frank chose me for a reason. I wiped my face, squared my shoulders, and stepped out into the sunlight. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I didn't plan what I was going to do. I just knew that if I stayed inside that house 1 second longer, I would drown in the silence they left behind. The air felt too heavy. The rooms too small. The grief too loud. So I grabbed my purse, locked the door behind me, and stepped into the sunlight. As I walked toward my car, my other car, the one Frank and I bought 15 years ago, the replacement we never fully loved because it didn't have the same history, the same stories, the same heartbeat, my stomach twisted with a mix of fear and determination. The DMV wasn't far. 15 minutes if traffic was light, 25 if people decided to forget how to drive. I barely remembered the drive there. My thoughts were too loud. Every memory of Frank polishing that old car played behind my eyelids like a film I couldn't turn off. By the time I pulled into the DMV parking lot, I was shaking, not from fear, but from the enormous truth pressing against the edges of my mind. If something was wrong with the sale, this was the only place that would show it. And if everything wasn't wrong, then I would have to face an even darker truth. My son didn't care about me at all. Inside the DMV, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. People shuffled in slow, miserable lines, clinging to paper slips and impatient sighs. The place smelled like paper, old coffee, and impatience. I approached the counter, and the woman sitting behind the computer looked up with a kind of tired sympathy only DMV employees have mastered. She was older, maybe mid-60s, with kind eyes, silver hair pulled into a bun, and a soft Chicago accent that wrapped around her words like a warm scarf. "Next," she called. I stepped forward. I need to look up a vehicle transfer," I said, my voice unsteady. She blinked, then nodded gently. "Title transfer? You got the plate number?" My hands fumbled through my purse as I retrieved the tiny notebook Frank used to keep in the glove compartment. I'd memorized the plate, but seeing his handwriting was different. Painful and grounding at the same time. "Yes," I whispered, sliding the page toward her. She tapped on her keyboard, her nails clicking in a steady rhythm. Her brows slowly drew together. "Huh," she murmured. My heart stopped. "What?" I asked, leaning onto the counter. She glanced up, hesitating. "You said you're the co-owner on this car, right?" "Yes." "Well," she turned the screen slightly, and my breath caught. The transfer had been filed yesterday, but the initial sale record, the first time the buyer paid, was from 2 months ago. That can't be right," I whispered. "My son told me he sold it yesterday." The clerk's eyes softened. "Honey, the system doesn't lie. The buyer signed the initial purchase document 2 months back. Yesterday was just the official transfer." My blood ran cold, cold enough to burn. But why would my son lie about when he sold it? The clerk looked at me like she already knew the answer, but didn't want to say it out loud. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said quietly. "I can't speak for your family, but I can print the buyer's information." She hid a few more keys, then the printer whirred to life. Name, address, sale amount. When she handed the paper to me, my fingers trembled. "He paid," my voice cracked. "He paid 3 times what my son told me he got." The clerk frowned deeper. "That's a lot of money to misplace." Misplace. The polite word for steal. "Do you want me to verify the signatures?" she added gently. I nodded. She studied the digital file closely. "The buyer signed here. And the co-owner, that signature looks like someone tried to imitate it. My heart slammed against my ribs. That wasn't my signature. Frank would have known instantly. I knew instantly. Someone had forged my name. I pressed my hand against my chest to steady the panic clawing its way up my throat. She printed an additional copy of the title transfer record and slid it toward me discreetly. "You didn't get this from me," she whispered, "but I think you should talk to that buyer." I swallowed hard and nodded. Then I left. The buyer lived across town in a quiet neighborhood with manicured lawns and brick homes that looked like they belonged in a magazine. The kind of place Frank always admired but said was too tidy to be real. My palms sweated as I walked up the driveway. The car wasn't in sight, but that didn't settle me. Not even a little. I rang the bell. Seconds later, the door swung open to reveal a tall man in his late 50s. Clean-shaven, warm brown eyes, neat shirt. Something about him felt calm, steady, familiar even though I'd never seen him before. "Yes," he asked. "My name is Dorothy. My son sold you my husband's car." His eyes softened instantly. He stepped aside. "Come in." No surprise. No confusion. Almost expectation. And that made my stomach twist again. We walked into his living room. On the table sat a folder. A manila folder. As if he had been waiting for exactly this conversation. He sat down, nodded toward the seat across from him, and said something that made my breath catch. "Before we talk, I need to show you what your husband left behind." And just like that, I knew my son wasn't the only one hiding something. The buyer didn't move at first. He simply rested his hand on the folder sitting on the coffee table, studying me with a strange mixture of empathy and calculation. Like he had been preparing for this moment, but still wasn't sure how gently to deliver the truth. "My name is Daniel," he finally said. "Your husband and we weren't close friends. More like acquaintances. But we spoke enough for him to tell me the car meant something to you." I blinked. "You knew my husband?" "In passing," he said carefully. "But he came to see me 3 months before he passed. He wanted to make arrangements. Said he didn't trust certain things happening around him anymore." My breath hitched. Around him? What things? What did Frank see that I didn't? Daniel opened the folder. Inside were several documents neatly organized, but on top of everything else was a single, sealed envelope, aged, slightly yellow around the edges, my name written across the front in Frank's unmistakable handwriting. My heart dropped into my stomach. It wasn't just the handwriting, it was the formality of it. Frank only wrote my name like that in 2 situations: anniversary letters and emergencies. My fingers hovered above the envelope, but Daniel gently pushed it closer. He told me, Daniel said softly, that if this envelope ever needed to reach you, it meant something had gone wrong. Very wrong. A thick silence settled between us. I finally slid my finger beneath the flap and opened it. Inside was a letter. But not just any letter. This one wasn't folded neatly. It had creases in odd places. Like it had been opened, reread, refold, hidden, reopened. As though Frank had written it under stress, or fear, or urgency. I pulled the paper out and unfolded it carefully. His handwriting looked a little shaky. Not messy, just not his usual perfect script. "Dorothy," it began. "If you're reading this, I wasn't able to speak to you openly before things turned." My lungs tightened. I read on. "I need you to know that I love you, and everything I'm doing now is to protect you, not from strangers, but from someone inside the family. Please don't blame yourself for not seeing it. I didn't want to see it either." I froze. Inside the family. No. He couldn't mean, but a part of me already understood. Frank had always been observant, patient, quietly aware of patterns. If he saw something, it was because it was undeniable. My eyes burned as I kept reading. "I believe Mike is in trouble. Serious trouble. And I believe he is making choices that could put you at risk after I'm gone." My hands shook violently. Daniel must have noticed because he quietly stood and walked to the adjoining garage, returning with a box. "This was in the car," he said. "Your husband asked me to keep it until I could verify you were safe, or until you came looking. He set the box down gently. It was small, wooden, and familiar. Frank made it. He built it with his own hands 20 years ago to hold our anniversary photos. I ran my fingertips across the grooves. I could almost hear his chuckle as he struggled with the hinges the first time. You'd think after 40 years I'd know how to make a box. Back inside the envelope was a second sheet, much smaller, stiff like old card paper. On it was a sequence of numbers. 07, 22 to 19, for C, B2, 17 to 11. And beneath it, this will make sense when you open the box. Do it somewhere safe. Love you always. Frank. I looked up at Daniel, my throat too tight to speak. He nodded toward the box. That isn't the only thing he left, he said quietly. What do you mean? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Your husband told me someone would come for the car one day. Someone who wasn't you. And he told me to sell it anyway if it meant keeping it out of dangerous hands. I didn't understand what he meant until your son showed up. My breath stopped. My son came here? I whispered. Daniel nodded. 2 months ago.
2
months
ago.
Long before he told me he sold the car. Long before he claimed it was yesterday. What did he say? My voice cracked, dry and brittle. Daniel exhaled. He said he was acting on your behalf, that you wanted the sale, but it didn't sit right with me. I'd already spoken with your husband, so I made him sign a statement. Paperwork to protect myself. And he signed it under a different story each time I asked for clarification. He lied, I whispered. Daniel's silence confirmed enough. And when he came back to finalize the transfer yesterday, Daniel continued. He looked nervous, jumping at every sound. He wasn't here for money. He wasn't here for the car's value. He was here to get rid of something. Something he believed was inside. I stared down at the wooden box. The envelope. The cryptic code. The forged signature. The sale date that didn't match. Frank's warning. My son's panic. And everything snapped sharply into place, like glass breaking. My son didn't sell the car because he needed money. He sold it because he wanted to erase whatever my husband hid inside that box. Whatever truth was big enough and dangerous enough that Frank left clues scattered like breadcrumbs for me to find. And for the first time, a tremor of fear slid cold and fast down my spine. Because if my husband was right, if he believed our son was dangerous, then the truth inside that box wasn't just a secret. It was a warning. I left Daniel's house with the wooden box pressed against my chest like a second heartbeat. It felt heavier than it should, heavy with secrets, with dread, with something I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. The envelope, the numbers, the trembling handwriting, every piece of it throbbed with warning. My husband had tried to protect me even in death. But from what? From whom? By the time I pulled into my driveway, evening shadows had stretched long across the yard. The air felt thick, too still, the kind of quiet that sets every nerve on edge. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. Then I saw it. The door was slightly open. Just a crack. Barely an inch. But wide enough that I knew I hadn't left it like that. My lungs tightened. I grabbed my purse, tucked the envelope and box inside, and stepped out of the car quietly. The gravel crunched under my shoes, each sound too loud in the thickening dusk. A cold wind brushed against the back of my neck. The house felt wrong. Not empty. Not abandoned. Disturbed. I pushed the door open slowly. Hello. I called softly. No answer. But the moment I stepped inside, I saw it. Papers scattered across the living room floor, drawers half opened, cushions tossed aside. My chest constricted. Someone had been searching. Not panicked, not sloppy. This was deliberate. I swallowed hard. Then a shadow moved deeper inside the room. Mom, I froze. My son stepped out from behind the sofa, phone in hand, breathing hard as though he'd been pacing or searching. He forced a smile. I've been calling you. You weren't answering. My pulse hammered painfully. Why are you in my house, Mike? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied me, really studied me, as if trying to read something on my face. Something he desperately needed to know. "Where were you?" he asked. His tone wasn't demanding, not this time. It was tight, controlled, carefully measured. The arrogance was gone. And in its place,
Fear.
I clutched my purse closer to my side. I had errands. What errands? Why does it matter? He took a step toward me, stopping when he realized I had retreated one step back. His face twitched, just slightly, but enough to tell me he noticed. "Mom, did you talk to the buyer?" There it was. The question he'd been circling around. The real reason he was here. The urgency, the searching, the scattered papers. It all pointed to this. I steadied my voice. "Yes, I did." He inhaled sharply, just a quick, involuntary sound, but the relief that flashed across his face was wrong. Not comforting. Not apologetic. Fear shifting into calculation. "What did he say?" he asked. I sensed the trap instantly. The subtle lean forward, the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around his phone. I lied. Nothing important. His jaw clenched. "Mom, don't do that." "Do what?" "Don't lie to me. Not today." He swallowed, trying to steady his voice. "Did he give you anything? Papers? Notes? Anything Dad left behind?" My stomach twisted. This wasn't the casual, dismissive son who told me I was being dramatic. This wasn't the smug adult who threw his father's memory away for cash. This was someone terrified of what I might know. And that fear made him dangerous. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said carefully. He ran a hand through his hair in agitation, a nervous gesture I hadn't seen since he was a boy. "Mom, listen to me. This is serious. I need to know exactly what he told you." I narrowed my eyes.
Why?
Why does it matter so much? His chest rose and fell faster. Because Dad didn't tell you everything. And if that man told you the wrong thing. The wrong thing, I interrupted. Or the right thing? His eyes snapped up to mine. The panic inside them was unmistakable. "Mom," he whispered, voice trembling, "I need you to trust me. Please." Trust. Trust? When he broke the one promise I begged him not to touch. When he forged my signature. When he lied about the sale date. When he tore apart my house looking for something my husband left. Trust? I repeated softly. "Is that what you're asking for?" He swallowed hard. "Did he give you a box?" he asked suddenly. My heart pounded so loudly I wondered if he could hear it. "A box," I echoed. "Mom, please," he said again. "Dad put things that don't need to be found in weird places." You know how paranoid he was at the end. At the end. Paranoid. Not careful. Not protective. Not concerned. It hit me like a punch. He wasn't trying to protect me. He was trying to rewrite the story. Paint Frank as unstable. Paint me as fragile. Paint the truth as dangerous. "Mike," I said quietly, "what are you looking for?" His eyes darted to my purse. Just a flicker. But enough. For the first time since he walked in, I heard it. Fear in his voice. That doesn't matter," he said, backing toward the door. "Just please call me if you find anything. Anything at all." He didn't wait for my response. He turned and left quickly, too quickly, leaving the door wide open behind him. The moment he was gone, I sank onto the couch, chest tight with realization. He wasn't afraid that the buyer lied. He wasn't afraid that I would misunderstand. He was afraid I had found exactly what he spent months trying to erase. And whatever secret Frank hid inside that wooden box, my son would do anything to keep me from seeing it. The house was too quiet after Mike left, quiet in a way that usually signaled safety. But now it felt like a warning. A countdown. A moment before impact. I locked the front door. Then locked it again. Then slid the chain across, because suddenly I didn't trust a simple key anymore. My hands trembled as I walked to the kitchen table and set my purse down carefully, almost reverently, because I knew what was inside wasn't just an object. It was the truth Frank died trying to protect. The wooden box felt warm in my hands. Familiar. Crafted with the same gentle precision he brought to everything. I remembered the day he made it. Snow outside, holiday music playing, the scent of cinnamon in the air. He'd carved our initials into the underside. F+D. Always intertwined. I ran my thumb along that engraving now, and it steadied me enough to lift the lid. Inside were 3 things. A folded letter. A small silver key. A single photograph, the old Polaroid kind that developed memories whether you wanted them to or not. I picked up the photo first. My breath caught. It was our son, Mike. But not as the boy I raised or the teenager who always smelled like motor oil and basketball sweat. This photo was recent. Maybe a year old. He stood outside a building I didn't recognize, shaking hands with a man whose face was blurred slightly by sun glare. But the worry wasn't the photo itself. It was what Frank wrote on the bottom corner. He lied to us. My heart pounded unsteadily. I set the photo down and unfolded the letter. Frank's handwriting wasn't his usual careful script. It was hurried, slanted, the handwriting of a man running out of time and trying desperately to get ahead of something dark. Dorothy, it began, if you're reading this, something has happened and I wasn't able to tell you everything. My pulse quickened. I didn't want to believe it when I first noticed the changes in Mike. The lies, the missing items, the sudden need for cash. At first I thought it was stress, a rough patch, but then I discovered the loans. Loans. The word felt like shards of glass in my chest. He used my name on documents I never signed. He created accounts I didn't authorize. And he began meeting people I know are dangerous, people who don't forgive debt lightly. A cold shiver ran down my back. Dangerous. Debt. Forged signatures. My son's panic suddenly made too much sense. I hired a private investigator and told him not to tell you until I knew how deep this went. It went deeper than I ever imagined. I pressed a hand to my mouth, trying to steady the rising panic. Mike didn't just owe money. He owed the kind of people who would come after family if he couldn't pay. The kind of people who would take a home, a car, a life. Tears blurred my vision. He started looking through my things. My drawers. My files. He asked questions he should never have needed answers to. I think he was preparing to take control of the finances, yours and mine. My knees weakened. He wasn't just irresponsible. He wasn't just desperate. He was dangerous. He asked about power of attorney, Dorothy. He asked about inheritance laws. My breathing stopped. I confronted him. He denied everything. But the next day, I found documents missing. A bank statement I had locked away. The spare key to the car. I felt sick. The car. That was why Mike sold it. Not because he needed money, but because he wanted to get rid of evidence hidden inside it. Evidence Frank hid. Evidence he never expected Mike to find. So, I hid the important documents inside the car's frame. If anything happened to me, I knew you'd eventually go through the car and find them. Inside the car's frame? But the car was gone, sold, transferred, no longer ours. Frank must have known this could happen. He must have suspected Mike would try to get to it first. I read on. If Mike ever sells the car or tries to remove it from the house, know this. He is trying to erase what I uncovered. The buyer I chose is trustworthy. He knows what to do. Daniel. The man who looked at me with concern, not confusion. The silver key unlocks a compartment in the car. The one I installed years ago. Inside that compartment are copies of everything. My heart dropped. Copies. If the originals were gone, this box held the only remaining truth. Protect yourself, Dorothy. Do not confront him alone. And no matter what happens, remember, I love you. I am with you. I will always be with you. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I wasn't ready for the final lines. If he lies to you about the sale date, he is deeper in trouble than I hoped. If he tries to see you suddenly, after months of distance, it is because he thinks you found this. If he goes through our things, he is looking for the evidence I hid. And if he becomes afraid, be careful. The last 3 words were underlined.
Be
Careful. I sank into my chair, breath shaking, heart pounding. Everything Frank warned me about had already happened. Mike forged my signature. He sold the car months ago. He lied to me. He ransacked my house. He came back immediately after I visited the buyer.
And now?
He was afraid. Not of losing money. Not of losing the car. But of losing control. I stared down at the code Frank left. 07, 22 to 19 for C, B2, 17 to 11. A code tied to the box. Tied to the car. Tied to something bigger than I understood yet. But one thing was painfully clear. This wasn't just about a car. This wasn't even about money. This was about a secret Frank died protecting. And a truth my son was willing to destroy, everything to bury. And I needed to know what that truth was. Before Mike did something neither of us could come back from. I didn't sleep that night. I opened the wooden box again and again, fumbling with Frank's little clues like a detective piecing together a map. The numbers, the photo, the silver key. Each of them clicked harder into place the more I thought about who my son had become and what my husband had known. The next morning I called the number Frank had scrawled in the margin of one of the papers, the private investigator's line. I expected a receptionist, a professional distance, a polite refusal. Instead, Thomas Chin answered on the second ring, his voice calm and unhurried as if he'd been waiting for this call his whole life. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "Your husband told me to expect you." I drove to his office, and what I found there felt less like a law firm waiting room and more like a vault of other people's secrets. Thick folders lined his desk, tagged, annotated, and heavy with the smell of paper and consequence. He didn't waste time on small talk. "You found the box," he said, sliding a folder toward me. Inside was a timeline, precise, cold, and brutal. Bank statements. Photocopies of loan agreements. Emails that read like a paper trail through a dark alley. The first page alone was enough to make my hands go numb. There were transfers from our joint accounts to places I didn't recognize. There were withdrawals labeled repayment, loan, business expenses, all signed with my husband's name. Except they weren't signed by my husband. Not every time. Some signatures were mine. Others were forgeries. And nested among them were memos with shorthand I didn't understand. Sullivan Investments Escrow. Liquidate. Quick turnover. Transfer titles to LLC. Mike's company, Thomas said quietly. Sullivan Investments LLC. He set it up 6 years ago. Used it to flip properties, take quick loans, and move money around. The problem is, he didn't own the capital he claimed to have. He borrowed against assets that didn't legally belong to him. My face felt numb. The folder contained a copy of the private investigator's report, dated months before Frank died. It was a list of findings so detailed it read like an indictment. Multiple offshore betting account payments traced to accounts tied to Mike's phone. Wire transfers to unknown recipients the week before Frank's final hospitalization. Loans secured using forged proof of income and falsified tax records. Conversations recorded, yes, recorded, with loan brokers and people who I recognized from newspaper photos about illegal payday lenders. A pattern of predatory borrowing and then leveraging family assets to cover losses. Thomas slid over a small stack of audio transcripts. My husband's voice drifted from the speakers the way a ghost does. Calm, tired, and precise. "I've been watching Mike," Frank had said in one file. "Not to spy, because I feared for him. He's borrowing from the wrong people. If something happens, protect yourself. You'll find things if you look. Don't let him take everything." The words were simple, but the rest of the evidence was damning. Thomas explained how Frank had wired up certain rooms in the house months earlier, not to trap conversations for spite, but to capture incontrovertible proof in case someone tried to manipulate the family after he was gone. "You recorded him?" I breathed. "On your husband's request," Thomas replied. "And what the recordings show is extensive. They show conversations where Mike and another man, identified as Victor in the transcripts, discussed forced transfers, power of attorney, and timing. They discussed making your decisions look unsteady to outside observers. They planned to cloud your agency. My blood ran cold. Thomas pushed further. He laid out email chains where Mike corresponded with a local attorney, someone he'd been bribing to draft documents to make it easier to challenge your competency. There were receipts for meetings at nursing advocacy centers, apparently to research the language and process to have an elder declared incapable. They were building a case, Thomas said. A legal paper trail, engineered. My report also shows that when you began asking questions about the title, Mike accelerated his actions. He sold the car, he signed over things, and he moved quickly to cover tracks. Then Thomas opened a sealed envelope and pulled out a flash drive. This contains files we recovered from his laptop after we traced recent transfers, he said. There are copies of bank downloads, PDFs of fraudulent loan applications, screenshots of messages where he bragged about short-term cash from selling assets, and audio. He clicked a file and a voice filled the room. A rough, hurried voice that was definitely not my son's. It belonged to a man who sounded like a broker. We need those titles gone. Get them out of the house. If she finds anything, burn it. Move the car. Get rid of props. My hand flew to my mouth. Thomas handed me transcriptions of conversations where Mike casually discussed making Mom appear forgetful and pressuring her to sign, while laughing with companions who had no right to that laughter. There were messages where Mike negotiated amounts with a buyer, amounts that conflicted with what he told me. There were photographs of a storage unit receipt, dated weeks before the supposed sale. And the box. I asked, voice raw. Frank had made copies, Thomas explained, copies of bank statements and property deeds tucked into small wooden caches he built and hid. The silver key was a backup in case the car itself was removed. The idea was that if light ever fell on the truth, a careful hand could open it. But your son, Thomas said, tried to get there first. He sold the car to someone who would take it away, thinking the buyer would dispose of it or destroy evidence.
You see, Mrs.
Sullivan, he didn't expect your husband to plan for this long after his death. Every page, every recording, every picture painted the same chilling portrait. A son who had quietly turned predatory, a man who expected to inherit without a fight and was now cornered by the man he'd tried to manipulate. I sat back hard in the chair. I felt betrayed, yes, but beneath that, what rose most sharply was a sense of clarity. Frank had seen it. He had acted. He had left instructions. He had left a map. And now, because of that map and the work Thomas had done, the paper trail existed, not only to protect me, but to ensure that those who acted would be held accountable.
The OH. My
God. Moment had landed not as surprise, but as consequence. Every little lie, every forged signature, every secret meeting had been recorded, archived, and now, finally, it would speak. I looked at Thomas. My voice was steady, but small. Do what you need to do, I said, and call the authorities. He nodded, and together we began to build a case that would break the illusion my son had made. The house felt different when I walked back into it that evening. Not hollow, not fragile. Steady. Ready. As if the walls themselves sensed that whatever had been haunting them for months was about to be dragged out into the light. I placed the file Thomas gave me, thick, heavy, bursting with evidence, onto the coffee table. The wooden box sat beside it like a witness. I didn't bother hiding any of it. Let them see it. Let them choke on it. And I waited. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when the sound came. 2 car doors slamming, one after another, quick and frantic. Voices.
Raised. Tense.
My heartbeat didn't speed up. Not anymore. By the time they burst through the door without knocking, my son first, Lacey right behind him. I was already seated in Frank's old armchair, the box and documents arranged in front of me, as if I were presiding over a trial. Mike stopped dead the moment he saw the folder. Lacey froze beside him, eyes narrowing. Neither of them spoke. For the first time in months, the silence belonged to me. I'm glad you're both here, I said, my voice even. Sit down. They exchanged a look, one of those silent conversations they thought I never noticed. But this time, something was off. Their faces weren't smug. They were tight, pale, afraid. Slowly, reluctantly, they sat. Mike leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Mom, what did that man tell you? That depends, I said. Which man? The one who bought the car 2 months ago, or the one you forced him to pretend sold it yesterday?
His jaw tightened.
Lacey looked away. I don't know what you think you know, Mike began. I cut him off with a single motion, sliding the first photo across the table. The picture of him standing beside the man outside that unfamiliar building. Frank's handwriting scrawled across the bottom. He lied to us. Mike's face went gray. Mom. Don't, I snapped, and my voice cracked like a whip through the room. Not this time. Lacey crossed her arms, defensive. That picture doesn't prove anything. Good, I said calmly. Then let's look at what does. I opened the folder. On top was the forged title transfer. The signature that was supposed to be mine but wasn't. I slid it toward them. Mike's eyes darted across the page, his breathing quickening. Next came the forged bank statements, the unauthorized loans, the escrow transfers he'd orchestrated under Frank's name, the emails coordinating with the predatory lenders, the transcripts of recorded conversations. All of it. Every page hit the table like a hammer. Lacey's composure snapped. What is all this? She hissed at Mike. What did you do? He glared back at her. Shut up. But his voice trembled. Then he turned to me, face twisted in desperation. Mom, you have to understand. Those people recorded me illegally. None of that holds up. I picked up a USB drive and placed it delicately between us. This, I said, isn't illegal. Your father recorded you in our home. He recorded you talking about forcing me to sign things. He recorded you laughing about taking control of the finances. Mike shot to his feet. Dad was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. I stood too, slowly, deliberately.
Sit
down. He froze. Because I didn't raise my voice. I didn't sound emotional. I sounded like someone delivering a sentence. He sank back into the chair. Then I showed them the letter. The one Frank wrote. The confession. The warnings. The evidence of the secret compartment in the car. Lacey's face drained completely. She started shaking her head. No, Mike, you told me she'd never find anything. The mask fell. And in that moment, they both revealed who they truly were. Lacey wasn't clueless. She wasn't innocent. She had known something. Maybe not everything, but enough to stand beside him and help him execute his plan. I walked around the coffee table and stood in front of them. Do you know what hurts the most? I asked quietly. Neither answered. It's not the money you took. It's not the papers you forged. It's not even the fact that you tried to make me look incompetent. Mike's eyes flickered. It's that you looked at me, I whispered, your own mother, and decided I was disposable. Silence. Heavy. Devastating. Truthful. Lacey opened her mouth, but I raised a hand.
No, not now.
I leaned in just enough for them to hear the next sentence clearly. I know everything. Mike's breath hitched. Lacey let out a small gasp. I watched their faces drain of color, exactly the moment Frank wanted me to see. Exactly the moment he prepared me for. I straightened my shoulders. From this moment forward, I said, You no longer speak to me unless through an attorney. Mike stood again, shaking, angry, desperate.
Mom, don't do this.
You're going to ruin my life. You ruined your own, I said. Then I pointed toward the door. Get out. Lacey didn't wait for him. She bolted first, eyes glistening with panic. Mike lingered for 1 second longer, staring at me as if hoping the mother he remembered might appear and forgive him. But that mother died the moment he sold the car that held my husband's last message. So, I turned away. And when I heard the door slam behind them, it didn't shake anymore. It sounded like closure. They came the next morning like storm clouds, neat shoes, polished briefcases, the kind of practiced smiles that smell faintly of invoices. I had expected them to call. I hadn't expected them to arrive on my doorstep before breakfast, like vultures in business suits. Two people stepped out of a black sedan and onto my porch. One woman named Catherine Wells, all soft words and sharper eyes, and a man named David Kim, whose tablet looked like an extension of his hand. They introduced themselves with the kind of courtesy that only exists when someone is trying to take something from you, without leaving footprints. "We represent Michael Sullivan," Catherine said, voice warm enough to make you lower your guard. "We're here to discuss some temporary arrangements, purely for his protection and yours." I didn't invite them in, but I didn't slam the door either. I let them stand on my porch and watch their faces, as if they were paper I could read. "Let me be clear," I said, keeping my tone low and steady. "You will not, under any circumstances, make me sign anything today." David opened his tablet, as if to show me pre-drafted forms. "Mrs. Sullivan, sometimes these things are easier handled cooperatively. Power of attorney, temporary, just while things are sorted." A laugh bubbled out of Catherine, too bright, too rehearsed. "You wouldn't want a court deciding this for you. It's faster if we do it amicably." I thought of my husband's letter. If he asks about power of attorney, do not sign. I thought of the transcript Thomas had handed me where my son and his associates had laughed about making me look unsteady. I thought of the recordings, my husband's careful, weary voice, telling me he had prepared for this.
"No," I said.
"I will not sign anything. I won't let my son manipulate me into surrendering control of my life." They looked momentarily surprised, then annoyed. Catherine's smile thinned. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said, a little less gentle now, "if your son believes you're making decisions that could be harmful to your well-being, he can petition the court to have a guardian or conservator appointed. That is a legal mechanism used to protect vulnerable adults." She said it like a courtesy, like a possible next step, like a weapon already polished. I felt the room tilt. This was exactly what his private investigator had warned me about. This was the plan Frank had seen months ago. "I'm aware of that process," I said. "And if he files anything, we will respond. My husband anticipated this, and he left me protections. I have legal counsel ready." That made them shift. Catherine's advantage had been the assumption I was alone and unrepresented. It vanished. After they left, huffing thin threats about escalating to court, I called Thomas Chin. He picked up in a heartbeat. "Mr. Chin," I said, feeling steadier than I had in weeks. "They're here. They try to get me to sign for power of attorney." "Good," he said. "Then you didn't sign."
"No."
"Don't. Let them file. We'll answer. And Mrs. Sullivan, your husband covered contingencies. We can move fast." In his office, Thomas laid out the plan like a general mapping a campaign. He filed an emergency notice with the probate court attaching Frank's sealed letters, the private investigator's report, and the audio transcripts. "We requested a temporary restraining order preventing my son or his associates from approaching me or accessing any of Frank's documents." He also filed motions to immediately freeze any transfers connected to Sullivan Investments LLC pending forensic accounting. "They won't like being stopped," Thomas warned. "But they can't move money that's been frozen. They can't transfer titles that are under litigation. And if they try to file for guardianship, we'll present the tapes, the transcripts, and the financial records showing fraud and forgery." It felt like an ugly countdown. Them with their threats, us with our paperwork. Their next move was a predictable one. A lawyer representing Mike filed a petition in family court claiming concern for my mental capacity and seeking temporary conservatorship. They painted a picture of a grieving widow too frail to manage complex finances. An image so familiar it could be sold as sympathy in any courtroom. Thomas responded immediately, delivering a binder that smelled of ink and iron, Frank's letter, the evidence Thomas had compiled, forensic handwriting analysis showing forged signatures, bank statements proving illicit transfers, and the recordings that had captured Mike admitting his intentions. We included Thomas's private investigator's sworn affidavit, timelines of suspicious activity, and proof of the buyer's chain of custody with Daniel, who had signed a notarized statement confirming he had been in contact with my husband and had safeguarded the car intentionally. The hearing was a storm of legal language and tense faces. Mike's lawyer, flat and practiced, tried to cast doubt on the recordings as manipulated, the transcripts as taken out of context, and the financial entries as legitimate business practices that needed explanation. I watched it all with a strange, steady detachment, like someone seeing scenes from another person's life. Then Thomas laid the final, clean move across the table, the legal structure Frank had put in place. Trust instruments that put large parts of the estate into irrevocable holdings unless jointly released by both spouses. Title protections. Contingency clauses that triggered the involvement of outside trustees if suspicious activity was detected. Frank had quietly, methodically, turned his paranoia into legal armor. The judge saw it plainly. When the gavel fell, the temporary conservatorship petition was denied. A limited restraining order was issued, prohibiting Mike and Lacey from contacting me, entering the property, or tampering with any assets. The court ordered a forensic audit of Sullivan Investments LLC and temporarily froze suspicious accounts. Mike's face when the judge read the order, pale, shattering, was worth every anxious hour waiting for it to happen. For the first time, his lawyer looked like someone who'd bitten off more than he could chew. But they weren't done. When paper closes one door, people with nothing to lose keep trying windows. Within days, the bank accounts I'd assumed safe were flagged with new withdrawal attempts. Small, testing transfers to offshore wallets, sudden attempts to move funds through shadow accounts. Thomas worked late into the nights, coordinating with the bank's fraud department and the forensic accountants. The day a federal investigator called to say they'd open a probe into suspicious wire transfers, I realized this had outgrown family drama and entered the arena of real criminal exposure. The war wasn't glamorous. It was phone calls, subpoenas, forensic logs, and quiet interviews with agents. It was exposing messages and proving connections. It was terrifying when detectives showed up on my porch not to arrest me but to ask detailed questions about my husband's records and my son's activities. And through it all, I kept one small ritual. Every night before bed I'd take out the wooden box Frank had made and read his letter again. It grounded me, reminded me that he'd not only loved me, he'd planned for this. The legal battle tightened like a vice around them. Their options narrowed. Their smug certainty shrank. But a war has many battles, and while the court had handed us a significant victory, the fight was far from over. They could still try desperate moves. They could still cut corners. They could still, if cornered enough, do something that would change everything. So I kept my phone charged, my lawyer close, and my resolve closer. Because Frank had told me to be careful, and I intended to listen. The day everything came crashing down didn't feel cinematic at first. It began quietly. Ugly gray clouds overhead, the kind that drag across the sky like torn fabric. The kind Frank used to predict rain from. I remember making tea, sitting in the kitchen, reading one of his old recipe cards as if looking at his handwriting could steady me. Then came the knock. Not frantic. Not polite. Heavy. Authoritative. 3 loud strikes that rattled the doorframe. I opened the door expecting Thomas or maybe another packet of legal documents. Instead, 2 federal agents stood on my porch. Badges displayed, faces carved from stone. "Mrs. Sullivan?" the taller one asked. "Yes," I said, heart thudding. "We're here regarding your son, Michael Sullivan. We need to ask you to remain available today. There will be movement on the case." Movement. The word sent a chill through my veins. They didn't explain further, not then, but their presence alone told me everything I needed to know. Something big was coming. They left, and I barely sat down before the next sound reached me. A roar of engines outside, loud and unignorably. I stepped onto the porch and saw them. 4 police cruisers. A black SUV with tinted windows. 2 unmarked vehicles. They lined the street like a blockade. My breath caught. They weren't here for me. They were here for him. They approached my son's house, just 2 blocks down. The flashing lights reflected off windows. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering. Doors cracked open. Curtains twitched. Lacey stepped outside first, face pale, wearing the robe she always claimed was imported linen. When she saw the officers approaching her driveway, her hand flew to her chest. "What's going on?" she shouted. "What is this? We didn't do anything." Her voice cracked, not with dignity, but with fear. Then Mike appeared behind her, disheveled, eyes red, hair messy, as if he'd barely slept. The moment he saw the agents, he stepped back instinctively, guilty before anyone said a word. "Michael Sullivan?" the lead agent called. Mike didn't answer. He just stared. "You are under investigation for financial fraud, identity theft, forgery, wire fraud, and intentional misrepresentation to federal institutions. We have warrants to search your property and seize all financial documents, electronics, and assets connected to the investigation." Lacey gasped. No, this is a mistake. There must be some mistake." But the officers brushed past her politely, moving toward the house with swift, coordinated precision. "Michael," the agent repeated, "step forward." Mike did the opposite. He stepped back. That's when they moved. 3 officers approached from the side, 1 from the back, trapping him. He looked around wildly, as if someone might swoop in and save him. His eyes found me, standing on my porch, hands folded, watching. His face crumbled. "Mom," he mouthed, desperate. "Please don't let them." But I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't save him, because he didn't deserve saving. 2 officers took him by the arms, reading him his rights. He staggered once, then straightened as if pride alone would keep him upright. Lacey screamed. It wasn't a dignified scream. It was messy, frantic, animalistic. She lunged toward the officers, but one gently redirected her aside. They handed her the warrant. She shook so hard the papers rattled. She shouted at the neighbors to stop staring. Nobody listened. The entire street watched. The people they'd once bragged to about money, vacations, new renovations, were all out on their porches now, witnessing the truth. A public undoing. The officers brought out box after box of evidence, computers, phones, folders, storage drives, property files. One brought out a briefcase stuffed with documents that looked familiar. Too familiar. Papers from my home. Papers that went missing. Papers my son had stolen. The agents logged each item meticulously as part of the seizure. They seized bank documents. They seized the laptop. They seized the business records. They seized the leather binder that used to belong to Frank, the one he kept his property assessments in. And then, my heart stopped. An officer wheeled out a black duffel bag stuffed with cash. Stacks. Wrapped. Labeled. Lacey screamed again. That's not ours. That's not ours. But everyone knew, including her, including Mike. They loaded everything into the SUV. Mike stood with his head down, wrists cuffed, jaw clenched as if he were fighting tears and rage simultaneously. And then came the final, unexpected blow. Daniel pulled up in his silver sedan. The buyer, the man Frank trusted. He walked straight toward the agents and handed over a sealed envelope. These are the original documents Mr. Sullivan hid in the car, he said clearly, loudly enough for every person on the street to hear. The ones he tried to sell off to destroy. My knees nearly buckled. But Daniel turned to me and nodded, a quiet promise that Frank's precautions had worked. When the agents put Mike in the back of the cruiser, he turned again to look at me. But this time, there was no plea on his face. Only anger, bitterness, the cruel kind of hatred people feel when their lives collapse under their own weight. As the cruiser pulled away, neighbors whispered. Lacey collapsed onto the curb, sobbing into her hands. The officers kept escorting boxes, documents, and electronics out of the house long after the sun went down. By the time they were done, the life Mike and Lacey had built on lies looked hollow, empty, stripped down to boarded truths. And me? I went back into my house, closed the door behind me, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not triumph, but relief. Justice. Finally. Fully.
Completely.
The weight Frank carried was finally being lifted. The truth he died protecting had survived. And the people who betrayed him, who betrayed me, were now facing exactly what they earned. Later that night, Daniel returned one last time. He walked up my porch steps with a gentle smile. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said softly, placing keys in my hand. "Your husband's car, it's yours again." My breath caught as the metal touched my skin.
Warm.
Familiar.
Home.
I closed my fingers around the keys. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't vengeful. It was quiet.
Steady.
And deeply, achingly right. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel haunted. Not by fear. Not by tension. Not by the quiet, creeping dread that had slowly woven itself into the walls while I tried to pretend everything was fine. It felt peaceful. I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea, Frank's old black mug, the one with the chip in the rim he refused to throw away. Steam curled upward like a soft exhale, the kind he used to make when he settled into his favorite chair after a long day. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled through the windows, warm and golden, touching the surfaces of the home we built together. The quiet wasn't sharp anymore. It wasn't accusing or waiting. It felt like a blessing. When the knock came, it wasn't loud or frantic. Just gentle. Almost shy. I opened the door and saw my granddaughter standing there, Maya, with her backpack still slung over one shoulder and eyes that still held the softness she'd had as a child. She hesitated, as if unsure if she was welcome. "Grandma," she murmured. "Dad told me not to come here. But I wanted to check on you." I felt something warm bloom in my chest. "Come here," I whispered. She stepped into my arms, and in that moment, the heaviness of the past months melted like snow. She hugged me tightly, her breath shaky against my shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know what was happening.
I thought you and Dad were just arguing.
I didn't know he—" "Hush," I said softly. "None of this is your fault." We sat together in the living room, and I told her only what she needed to hear. Not the darkest details, not the ugliest truths, just enough for her to understand that people sometimes lose themselves, and sometimes love isn't enough to pull them back. She listened with her hands wrapped around a mug of cocoa, nodding, eyes shining with something I feared had been lost forever. Understanding. Empathy.
Love.
"I miss Grandpa," she whispered.
"Me too," I said.
"Every day." She glanced at the wooden box, the scattered documents now neatly organized, the envelope with Frank's handwriting carefully tucked away. "What was he like," she asked, "when you two were younger?" So I told her. Stories from our early marriage. How he danced terribly, but insisted on dancing anyway. How he once drove 40 miles in the rain because he forgot his lunch and didn't want me to worry. How he shined that car every Saturday morning, even when his back hurt. How he always believed love wasn't loud, it was steady. She laughed.
She cried.
And for the first time since Frank's funeral, the house felt full again. After she left, I walked outside with the keys Daniel had returned to me. I approached the car slowly, almost reverently, the way you approach something living and breathing. The paint gleamed softly in the fading light. The chrome trim winked like an old friend. When I opened the door, the familiar scent, leather and pine and faint cologne, wrapped around me like a warm embrace. I sank into the driver's seat. My hands found the steering wheel automatically. My breath shuddered, then steadied. "Thank you," I whispered into the quiet. "For protecting me. For protecting us." I didn't mean the car. I meant Frank. I held the silver key, the one he left for me. I slid it into the small hidden compartment he'd built years ago. Inside was another envelope. This one didn't contain warnings or evidence. Just a note written in the elegant script I fell in love with at 19. "If you are reading this, it means you made it through. And you always do, Dorothy. You always do." I pressed the letter to my chest and let the tears come, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. The man I loved had protected me even after death. And now, as the last rays of sunlight spilled across the hood of the car, I felt something shift inside me. Relief.
Peace.
And finally, closure. I watched the quiet street, the wind softly rustling through the old maple tree Frank planted the year Maya was born. Life, it seemed, had a way of circling back, healing in ways we don't expect, breaking in places that could grow stronger. The truth was harsh. The betrayal was devastating. But the protection? The love? The justice? It was overwhelming in its own quiet, powerful way. I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes, and whispered a final line into the stillness. One that felt like an ending and a beginning all at once. The greatest inheritances aren't made of money. They're made of protection. I placed the letter back in the compartment, closed it gently, and stepped out of the car. The last light of day brushing over me like Frank's hand on my shoulder. I walked back toward the house, turning once to look at the car, my heart lighter than it had been in months. Then, softly, with a smile that surprised me, I spoke the final words meant for anyone listening. Thanks for listening. If you have a story like this, share it in the comments. Your voice deserves to be heard. And with that, a chapter ended, and a stronger one began.